Well, hello guys. It's David Thos again. Hope you're having a wonderful day. Oh, I got so many amazing things to talk about today. We're going to cover the history of the mysteries. But we're probably not going to get all the way through this because there's a lot of stuff to cover. What you're looking at there is the temple of, well, they call it Baalbek today. It was originally the temple of Bachus. And originally it was the beginning of the mysteries that was started by Elijah the prophet. So we're going to cover this history, and I want to show you some very interesting things. So this might start off a bit slow because, it's history. But what we're going to find out, if you're interested in knowing things that the entire world is lost, these things that will change your life and, give a basis for what we believe and help us to understand what the whole world's doing and why we're in this mess, then stay tuned, friends. Just be patient. This is going to really blow your mind. Now, here's an article on the city of Nain that I want to read you here for a moment because this really covers pretty much everything that I wanted to share with you to get us into this information. It's funny because almost, as far as I know, most Christians have never even heard of this. Although it is a story in the Bible. We've heard about the story where Jesus meets the woman at the well. It's a big deal, right? It's a little story, and it's very symbolic of very important things. He says to the woman who's being stoned, I don't condemn. We all know about these stories. The man who was trying to get down into the well. We've talked about a lot of these. But it seems like we always neglect this particular story because it's an important story. Probably the reason why people don't talk about it is they don't understand the significance. Just as they didn't understand that woman that Jesus kept finding that was either a harlot or an adulterer or a woman who had a husband that was not her own. All of these are about the same storyline. So here we have another, it's about the same storyline. Not only in connection with some of the other miracles that Jesus was doing. First of all, on the way to the city of Nain to resurrect this child from the dead, from a widow, same thing that Elijah did, the widow's son, the same thing that Elisha did, which we'll talk about. But on the way, he meets a woman with a flow of blood for 12 years, who is healed because she touches him. Well, this is all very symbolic. The woman who has a flow of blood 12 years. The flow of blood is the curse, and Jesus removed the curse from the woman. Well, that's very significant, I would think. Along with the fact that a particular widow who represents a certain priesthood. Remember, we talked about John the Baptist was of the Aaronic priesthood. His mother Elizabeth was very important. Jesus said there's never been born a man born of woman greater than John the Baptist. He was the greatest of men under the old covenant, under these old ways. He was of the lineage of Aaron. And John the Baptist said, look, my way, my priesthood's lower. I'm not willing, I'm not worthy. My priesthood, not just John the Baptist, the greatest man who ever born from a woman, but he says this priesthood of Aaron isn't even worthy to untie the sandal lace from Jesus. Why? Because Jesus is Melchizedek priesthood. Jesus wasn't from Jerusalem. Where John the Baptist was born was near Jerusalem, the city of Jerusalem. It was basically an outskirt, a suburb of Jerusalem. It was in Jerusalem. And he was one of the priests. And they were raised there and took and officiated at the temple. But the Jewish people did not want the truth or the true priesthood. And they killed their own prophets and they beheaded John. That was the end of their priesthood, basically, because their priests were illegitimate. But there's another priesthood that's going to have their child raised up. Remember Elijah, when he went to the widow's son and raised him up. Well, there was a famine in Israel. There wasn't any truth. They were starving. But the truth was provided by the widow who had a jar of oil and a jar of flour, and it never ran out. This is the Holy Sacrament. We'll talk about that. But the Holy Sacrament is not something that the Judeans did. They did Passover and, Feast of Trumpets and all these other things, but they didn't do the Holy Sacrament, which was given by El Elyon, and Melchizedek brought bread and wine. So Melchizedek is a higher priesthood. And that was carried on by Elijah at Bethel, and then he went and took it to Mount Carmel up in the north area up by Syria. So you might be able to tell already what we're getting at here. So there were then two priesthoods. Well, what do you mean, Dave? There's just the Aaronic priesthood. There's no Melchizedek priesthood. The Jews, if they'd have had a Melchizedek priesthood, they would have known that, don't you think? Well, it's in their scriptures. It's in the book of Hebrews, if you want to believe the scriptures in the New Testament. Okay, it's in the Old Testament, where Abraham met Melchizedek and he gave him bread and wine, made a promise. No law, no sacrifice, no give me your firstborn son, nothing. Just, I promise you, you will be a multitude in the earth and I will bless you. That's it. And Paul says that the law came 430 years after that, later. And it did not make the promise void. It didn't take away the promise. The promise is still good, even though people are under the illusion because they're worshiping the deceiver, the liar, the accuser. And by means of deception, they've fallen into this place where they sold their soul and began to beat their fellow servants and drink and eat with the drunkards. This unholy sacrament of death, right? The bitter herbs and the unleavened bread of suffering and torture and evil. So the other priesthood existed. What happened to it? Well, Elijah had it, but he had also the other priesthood. Remember, Moses had both. Moses got the priesthood from Jethro because he married his daughter Zipporah. And Zipporah said, oh, you're a bloody priesthood because he required circumcision. And she didn't like it. Well, the only reason why Moses and his father-in-law, Jethro, originally Ruel, he became Jethro or Yahthro because he and Moses devised a plan to make a lower priesthood because the people didn't want the higher priesthood. They couldn't just partake of the Lord and his body and blood and become like God, knowing good and evil and receive eternal life. They rejected it. Their lust, they chose. They made a decision. They were deceived by the deceiver. They wanted to go back to Egypt. So they came down and went to another mountain, broke those commandments, got rid of that. It was lost. See? They broke that commandment. Now, it wasn't completely lost because as it went down, there was Deborah sat under the tree and the Holy Spirit came to her again because the Holy Mother wanted to reveal the truth. She had disciples. She had Samson and Samuel and David. All these were her students. She started the tradition of a disciple and their masters, or the master and the disciples, I should say. So to this day, Jesus was a master and he had disciples. John the Baptist had disciples. John the Baptist came in the tradition of Elijah, who had disciples, who came in the tradition of Samuel, who came in the tradition of Deborah, the mother of Israel. It was a priesthood where, yes, women could officiate. And did. There were women. All the way along, there were women. Jesus, when he was on the earth, had many women there. The holy virgins. The Vestal virgins, which we'll talk about. What the connection of the Vestal? Well, that's Roman. It's pagan day. What are you talking about? Vestal virgins, Eleusinian mysteries, and the Temple of Artemis, Mother Nature. Oh yeah, that was the other priesthood in northern Israel. The 10 tribes that were scattered in all the world and made the Buddhists and the Shintos and the Mithraism and the Zoroastrian, all the other religions in the world came from this priesthood, the higher one. But the Judeans forbade it. They shunned the woman. They stoned the woman. They separated the man, put a veil on the woman, and made her a widow. Well, what happened? You said John the Baptist was from Aaron. Yeah, he was. But you also said that John the Baptist had the mantle. He wore the camel hair garment, which is the same garment that Elijah wore. Well, remember, when Elijah left, Elijah went on his astral chariot into the astral realm. And he had already gone to Mount Horeb and he gotten the great truths. He had learned from Deborah under the tree of Morah, right? The Morah, the mountain. But you see, again, the people were starving, and they were starving for lack of knowledge. And they didn't have the holy priesthood, and they had put their prophets in a cave and rolled a rock over it, right? And killed all the prophets. Well, Elijah then saw the great apostasy happening right there of the Aaronic low, and so that was because of the Aaronic priesthood that he held. But he also had the Melchizedek priesthood. So he had a disciple named Elisha, and Elisha said, Master, when you go into heaven and you leave the earth, because he's getting ready to leave, he says, I want 2 parts of your power. I want a greater priesthood. I want dynamic, powerful, better than Aaron. I want the other priesthood, the Melchizedek, which is double the power. And Elijah said, well, if you can see me, if you can recognize, if you can know me, if you can wake up and become aware of that powerful truth, when I leave, then you will receive my mantle and have 2 parts of my power, double. So Elijah went up, the mantle fell upon Elisha. Now he had a greater priesthood. And Elisha went and found the Shunammite woman. First of all, him and her husband, he gave them a child. They were childless because that priesthood had lost the heirs. Judaism had murdered the woman, had abandoned and shunned everybody and murdered everybody and crucified and genocided and everybody else. And they were just about dead. The same thing happened when Jesus came to the world. And here was this woman caught in the act of adultery, well, prostitution, the holy whore, and they didn't like it. So they were going to stone her. It wasn't just some ordinary prostitute. So, Elijah left. And the Aaronic priesthood continued with Judaism, but remember, they were in famine. They didn't know the truth. They were starving, and they carried on this ridiculous blind deity, right? They were blind guides. Their deity was death and destruction. Your father's a liar and a deceiver. They continued on with this carnal bondage and curses upon the world. But the true priesthood went with Elisha and started the Elysian mysteries, and they created on Mount Carmel in the north, up in Syria, they created the mysteries. And this is where it carried on. So by the time that Jesus came, again, they had died again. Right? This priesthood was forbidden again by the Judeans. Remember, people don't understand that Judea is just a symbol for the world. The 72 on the Sanhedrin is the same 72 on the Senate floor of the Capitolium in Rome. It was the grand religion of Judaism, or the carnal lower priesthood. The other priests, the higher priesthood of enlightenment and partaking of the holy sacrament, was forbidden. And we'll talk about it. There were 6 of these women. They were called the Flame. We talked about it. It was in the movie, The 100. It was the original mysteries. It was the religion of the flame. And they had to keep the flame going, like the Olympic flame. If the flame went out, then the truth went out. Well, sometimes, ever so often, 10 times in the history, for 1,100 years, since Elijah started, and Elisha started the mysteries, for 1,100 years until Christ, it continued on, and only 10 times had that flame ever gone out. And in that case, when the flame went out, there was a procedure that had to be carried out to bring it back. The woman had to be stoned to death, or, because she didn't carry out her vows and her purity and keep the flame going. So if she let the flame go out, or if she did anything, then they were required to stone her and then sort of redeem her and go and find a widow to take her place. Because they were in the priesthood for 30 years. These women, they would become a priestess, a high priestess, and they would wear the white and so forth, and they were pure, and they would keep the flame going, and they would be used in government. They made laws. They were like queens that ran the country. And the only person that had any, that watched over them and was their equal was the Pontifex Maximus. And that whole system, we will find, finally came to an end in the exact year that we know, when the flame was completely put out and Christianity become completely apostate and forgot about these higher mysteries. Up in Greece and Rome, they forgot about these mysteries and became totally apostate and Judaized and went back under the law. And they declared anathema to the higher mysteries. And they ceased that priesthood and put out the flame in 394. And that was the last time that priesthood has ever worked openly in the world. And that was the great apostasy. Now think about this. We understand that Christianity was, we think, created by Jesus. Well, Jesus didn't say, okay, I'm making a new religion. It's going to be called Christ or Christianity. That's some word that he probably never even used. It's a Latinized way of saying. He may have said, I'm the Messiah, right? Although there's really not too many places where Jesus runs around saying, I am the Messiah. But many said of him, he is the Messiah. And in one language, that means the Christ, okay? But they were first called Christians in Antioch, up in Asia Minor. So while Jesus was alive and after he was alive for a long time, they weren't even called Christians. What were they? They were Ebionites. They were Essenes. The Essenes were priests that were with John the Baptist, that were out in the desert, that had been doing these things since Elijah. And they were now worshiping at the temple of Artemis and the temple of Eleusis and other places. And the great priesthood will explain how it arose with Romulus and Numa Pompilius, and how his daughter was made the high priest. And Rome was ruled by the great 6 holy Vestal virgins. And this went on down all the way to 394, when it was completely destroyed. And that was the great apostasy. Christianity was the mystery religions. It was Zoroastrianism. It was Mithraism. Christianity was the Eleusinian mysteries, started by Elisha and Elijah, carried on by John the Baptist and the Essenes. They weren't called Christians. So the great apostasy occurred slowly after Christ died. Judaism began to take root again and murder the woman and forbid and deceive and lie until there was like a split. Part of Rome was becoming Judeo-Christian. That was the apostasy. So when they forbade the mysteries in 394, when they stopped the higher mystery, the Eleusinian, they forbid the Holy Sacrament. That was what the Bible is talking about when the daily continual sacrifice, the fire, the flame, or the great mystery, the Holy Spirit from the mother ceased in the earth. Christianity then wasn't, it's amazing. I look at a lot of people and they're thinking that Jesus was some sort of a Judean. Maybe his name was Yeshua, which means Yahweh is Savior. That's not his name. His name was Savior. Isa. It wasn't Yeshua. They try so hard to manipulate the facts and deceive the people. But Jesus didn't worship Yahweh. And so Christianity was the mystery schools, the Essenes, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Damascus Scroll was one of the documents that we dug up the Dead Sea. The Damascus document. They lived up by Damascus, and Paul was on the road to Damascus and was initiated into the mysteries and heard the words that is unlawful for a person to speak. And when he received that information that he could not reveal to others, he went unto paradise out of his body and saw the Lord. So Christianity was the mystery schools. And so as we said in prior videos, there were 2 groups. We got the Israelites, the 10 tribes that are lost, and Judaism. We also have the 2 priesthoods, the 2 deities, and we have the 2 lineal descendants of Judah, Perez and Zerah. And there was a breach. So Perez went to the area that we call Judaism today. Zerah, that was a person who had a child. He was a child of Judah, and Zerah had the Dardanians, and the Dardanians created Troy. The Dardanian had a child named Annius. Annius had Romulus and Remus. They were twins. And that was the holy royal bloodline. They created Troy, Thebes, Rome, the lineage all the way up to Ireland, and the Tuatha De Danans. And then that went to Scotland and to England, and they met up with Dan at Lundan and Denmark, and the Danube and the Dinister and the Donister, and the Serpent's Trail led us all the way to where their final resting place was, and they set up this apostate religion of Dan, who carried some of the Aaronic priesthood with him, and they took Judaism to the world. And then in 400, they came down and took over the church, or the mystery religions. And they changed deity, or theo, to Dan, or Godan. And this is where we get the word God. And they forbade the holy mysteries and the Vestal virgins, and the flame was put out. And this is what we have today as Christianity. So Christianity is far from being the truth. It is the apostasy. It is the anti-truth. Christianity is the evil that plagues this world, the religion of Yahweh. But we'll talk about that here in a little bit, where this priesthood started. It was literally up there at the city of Nain, where Jesus was going to raise up that priesthood again in his lifetime. So John the Baptist then came down as the Aaronic priesthood, but they had rejected the Melchizedek priesthood. The Melchizedek priesthood then went with Elisha, who got 2 parts of his power. That started the Eleusinian mysteries, and those were the Melchizedek higher. That was where the real mysteries went forward there. The appendage, the one that is more or less created out of whole cloth by Jethro and Moses, because the people rejected the truth and gave them a lower priesthood and veiled their faces. And to this day, Paul says when the people read the Old Testament, they read it with a veil upon their faces. That's what's going on. And that's why John the Baptist only had the priesthood of Aaron and said very clearly, I'm not worthy to untie his sandal. I am only a little light, a small little light, like a lamp shining in the desert. And I am saying, I'm pointing everybody to him. I'm a voice in the wilderness. I'm not the true voice. I'm not the holy logos. I'm not the true light. Because Jesus is the light that lighteth every man that cometh into the world. It's the light of the sun, not just the light of the moon or a little lamp. So that's why John the Baptist then did not have the higher priesthood. Jesus was greater than he was. He wasn't talking about the man. Jesus was talking about his priesthood was greater. So the Judeans, when they beheaded John, they got rid of all of their authority right there. Because John was a great man and knew the higher mysteries, but he was only officiating at the lower ones. But he understood, like Moses, that there was a higher mystery, and he pointed it out and told him to go follow Jesus. That was the greater mysteries. And so this is where the mysteries came. And of course, this priesthood was handed down from the 10 tribes at Bethel originally, but who were later scattered into all the earth. And so we've talked about all these other priesthoods, the higher priesthoods around the world, some of which were there in Greece, the Temple of Artemis, the Eleusinian priesthood, and so forth. This was the Elisha who got 2 parts of Elijah's power after he saw him go up. He got his mantle. And Elisha started the priesthood up in Syria, where Paul was going to Damascus to see out of his body. He would reveal and be initiated, because he had heard the words, the truth. They had told him the mystery, which is the nature of the sacrament, and the body and blood of Christ, which is the great mystery. So we'll talk about all of that and see how it's connected. But There are stories in the Bible that explain all of this, but we don't pay any attention. Who was this widow at the city of Nain? This is a place called Shunem. Around the 9th century BC, the prophet Elisha, not Elijah, Elijah was taken to heaven, and when he was taken to heaven, his mantle fell off, and it fell upon Elisha, who got 2 parts of his power. In other words, the priesthood was raised up with power. Elisha, who started the Elijah mysteries. These were about the woman, because remember, Elijah and Elisha, their teacher was Deborah, the mother. So, it says their home was on the lower slopes of Mount Morah. Now, this is an interesting thing, too. Remember, a lot of these words are, sometimes there were no vowels, so that could be Mura, that could be Moriah. Sometimes we have other words that we think is a different mountain or something. It's the same word. It's also the same as Horeb. Morah, Hora, it's all about the ore, the light, the mountain of light. We've said that is the Great Pyramid. That is not where people think it is. You know, they're just assuming. There's little place names over there in Palestine today that people name something after the original. So, originally, Mount Moriah, we can prove, we've done this. We've proved it in many other videos. We've shown the evidence that Moriah was in Egypt, the Great Pyramid on the Nile. And it was the center of the hub, all the way around. They led the Israelites around 40 years, 360 degrees, 1,444. And they came out 144,000 with their banners, and they represent the wheel of fortune, or the wheel of rebirth and tribulation that we're going through. So, we showed that beneath Mount Horeb, which was another name for it, was the city of Orb. Today we have Chevron, Hebron, or Hebrews, or Horeb. These are all the people of the mountain. So, Morah, which was originally in Africa, the original Morah, Mount Meru, is on the Nile down the river, down in the deepest Africa. That was a real mountain. Later on, they started they called that the Holy Mountain. But then as time went on, they built a city and they built their own mountains. They built these temples to get to the high place and the sacred groves. They worshipped in these areas. So the original place where Abraham was taken was the Great Pyramid. And beneath it was a vortice, or a cave. And there was some dead men's bones. It's the hill of Golgotha. Remember, it says in Revelation, the 2 witnesses shall be put to death in the great city of Sodom and Egypt, where their Lord was also crucified. So the Lord, I don't know how many people understand that this is the original place there was in Egypt. So it says, and just a mile or 2 from the international coastal highway, a major trade route that stretched from Egypt to Damascus. Well, again, they're mixed up with their details, but if you read the Bible and you translate it correctly and you understand where these places were, the center of the world was at the Great Pyramid there in Egypt. And then all around was where the nations got their lot. And this is, we'll see this in the reading, whether it's the Old or New Testament. They're always on the way to Galilee, or they're always living on the Galilee, or preaching in Galilee, which means the circuit. The circuit is a wheel, a circle. Jesus preached, and many of these places that he would preach to were houses, Bethany, right? Bethlehem. These are houses of, right? The house of bread, the house of fish, the house, these are different astrological houses where he would go. And he would go to each of the tribes and give a witness and declare the gospel to reveal himself to them. So, this was the center of the world. Whose bones were under there were many people. For instance, Abraham died and was buried there under the Great Pyramid. Isaac, Jacob, probably King David and others. Solomon, who knows how many eventually have been buried. Many of them ended up having their own temples built, and then they were built under that. But the pharaohs were the priesthood of Ra, which is the true deity, as the New Testament says, because the divine one is light. Even theos has to do with light, or day, dia. So when he wasn't traveling, one of Elisha's bases was Mount Carmel. That was way up north of Damascus or something, up in Syria. We don't know exactly where it was. We may think we know. They may have named another mountain in that area Carmel today, but that's not the most ancient name of these places. You find this all over the world. You'll find just about anywhere in the world where there's a great river and a civilization along the river. The very first city that goes into the sea will always be an or. Even here in America, New Orleans and Jerusalem. The first part of that word is uru, or light, ora, and the last part is Salem, or peace. So it was the city of peace, the city of light, the center where the calm is. So always the cities have to do with light, because that they are the center where the river begins from the center of the galaxy. It's all as above, so below. It mimics the heavens, and they laid out their cities according to the ley lines. And people say, well, what's the ley line? Well, the ley lines are the lines they use to map the stars, not just the earth. So it was about 20 miles to the northwest of Shunem, as the crow flies. When Elisha's ministry took him from there to Galilee or other areas of the northeast of Judah, he'd travel along the international coastal highway, also known as the Via Maris. There's always a Mary in there, isn't there? Even the great temple, or the mountain Moriah, in Egyptian, the pyramids are Mr, or Moors, or Moors, or Moriahs. That's what they call them in the ancient holy hieroglyph, the holy glyphs, or writings. And when he did so, Shunem would be about a day's journey from Carmel. In short, it was an ideal place for Elisha to rest at the end of a long day of travel. All right, so Shunem was near Mount Carmel, which is far in the north. Had nothing, it was away from this place called Mount Moror, which is in Egypt. So Elisha passed by the Shunammite couple's home regularly. So much so, I don't even think most Christians have ever heard of the Shunammite story. But I had heard of it as a Jehovah's Witness. We talked about it vaguely back in the day, but we kind of got lost and nobody really talks about it. I haven't heard very many Christians ever even mention it. So much so that they built a guest room for him on the roof of their home. In response to their kindness, Elisha prophesied that the Lord would grant a son to them, as they were childless, and the following spring their son was born. Some years later, however, the son took ill and died in his mother's arms. She raced to Carmel on the back of a donkey, urging her servant not to slacken the pace. When we read this account, our mindset is governed by instant communication and fast travel, and the urgency of the mother's quest can give us the impression that Elisha returned to the woman's home in a matter of hours. But as they both didn't die until noon, she would not have reached Carmel until the evening, far too late to attempt a return journey the same day, just as Elisha had spent the night in the room the couple built for him. So she must have spent the night in Elisha's home. By the time they would have returned to Shunem, the boy would have been dead for at least 24 hours. Well, this is kind of speculation. They're trying to understand this in a literal sense. But much of this is very symbolic. I do believe that there were things that these things were patterned after. But the important part of this story is what it signifies about the priesthood. Because it was hidden up in these illusions, in these parables for all this time, so that we would understand in the latter days the true priesthood, which is in the north and not something that we call Judaism today. Two emphases. As the narrator tells the story, two emphases come across. The first is the woman's single-minded determination that only Elisha can help when her son dies. She lays him not on his own bed, but Elisha's bed. She calls her husband not for help with her son, but for help with saddling a donkey to visit Elisha. When he inquires further, she says simply, all is well, shalom. When Elisha's servant, Gehazi, greets her, she brushes him aside with another shalom and falls at Elisha's feet. When Elisha equips Gehazi with a staff and sends him back to Shunem with instructions to lay the staff on the boy's face, the woman refuses to go with him. As far as she is concerned, only Elisha can help. Except Elisha seems very much out of his depth, which is the second emphasis. See, they're trying to say that Elisha didn't know what to do. He's out of his depth. He doesn't, there's much more to the story. We're not trying to characterize the great prophet as a coward. That's not what the story's about. This is about something far more than just some child or a promise. Why would Elisha give this particular couple a child? It isn't just an ordinary child. This is the child, a firstborn son of a lineal descent, which is a priesthood that will be raised up. Not just be a child raised from the dead, but a child who has great prestige and power that carries on a tradition. And why is it talking about this child who died? Because, you see, the Judeans had no clue, because Yahweh had abandoned his wife, and she literally wandered the earth in mourning, and they tried to stone her, and she was ridiculed and hated and abused and made. In Israel, women were treated as slaves. They didn't want anything to do with the higher priesthood or the widow's son in Jerusalem. So, when the woman arrives at his home, he's forced to admit that although he can see she is in bitter distress, the Lord has hidden it from me and has not told me. Well, this is probably a symbol of the fact that even the great priesthood doesn't always understand what's happening. Sometimes people about ready to give up. They think, well, the Lord's not coming. He's not going to raise up his priesthood, his prophets, to tell us the truth or give us a vision. The vision begins to fade, and even the prophets are unsure of what's happening. They seek the Lord, and they seek the Lord. They have the mysteries, but they don't fully understand. John was looking for the Messiah. He says, who is it? I don't understand. So he only goes with the woman to Shunem because she insists on it. You see, because it's not always just up to the prophet. Maybe he isn't even as great as this woman in the story, because it's upon her insistence. She gives the instructions. Remember when Jesus hadn't performed any miracles yet, because it wasn't his time, Jesus said. It wasn't his time. He didn't have jurisdiction. He wasn't in charge. Well, who was in charge before Jesus was in charge? Well, remember the wedding at Cana. This was part of the mysteries, the wedding, the great wedding. This is what we're talking about, right? These are the first few miracles Jesus performed. What were they? They were the raising up of the great mysteries and the revealing of great truth and salvation and life. So they needed wine because they didn't have any wine at the wedding. What's the wine? This is the holy mysteries, the sacrament. And so Mary, the mother of the bridegroom, said, they have no wine. And Jesus said, what have I to do with thee? It is not yet my time. And so Mary turns to the people who were there at the feast, and she said, do whatever he says. I'm telling him I have the authority. He doesn't have the authority. So I'm going to go ahead and ask him to perform this authority, because you see, until the wedding occurs, he has no authority. See, the mother has the authority. Jesus is about to marry Mary Magdalene. Mary Magdalene. And his mother's in charge. And she says, whatever he says to do, do it. She instructs them. So, remember, Jesus said, my Father is greater than I am. And until Jesus was appointed and was told by his mother to perform the miracle, he could not do it. Now, his first attempt to raise the boy by equipping Gehazi with his staff results in no sound or sign of life. His second attempt is that this time accompanied by prayer, but is only slightly more successful. This time he lies on the child, and the child's flesh becomes warm. It's only when he repeats that process that finally the child opens his eyes. Finally he can tell the Shunammite woman that she can take her son. The story of the Shunammite woman's son. Well, this is symbolic of the difficulty that we will have in this world to preserve these truths. They must be resurrected several times. And it must be done by the power of the Holy Spirit. Only because our Heavenly Father loves us, and because of the love for the Shunammite woman and her son, the love for the holy mysteries, and the holy priestess and Mother Mary, this is the only reason that we will always and never ever be separated from her, even though Yahweh under his law has done so. But he may rule this world. Most of the world knows all about Judaism, and Christianity's been taken over by it, Judeo-Christian. The mysteries, though, were forbidden. The woman was veiled and abused and beaten and stoned to death. But don't worry, the Lord loves you. There's no doubt it's a great miracle. One of only 3 raisings of the dead in the whole of the Old Testament. And most people have never even heard about it. It's one of the only 3 in the Old Testament of raising a dead person. Most people have heard a couple of them vaguely. But the symbology of any of this, nobody knows. At the same time, Elisha's struggle to raise the boy gives the story a strangely muted feel, an impression exacerbated by the silence with which news of the boy's raising is greeted. The city of Nain. Now this is in the New Testament, not the Shunem, the city of Shunem or the Shunammite woman, but this is the city of Nain, the woman of Nain. But it's very similar. And this is, it says, this is done by Jesus. It says, let's fast forward 800 years and visit the same location, or at least a town just 3 or 4 miles away. By the time of Jesus, Shunem was no more. They didn't call it that anymore. Now they call it Nain, but most Christians wouldn't know that. So they think it's another story, or a story about a completely different thing. And they wouldn't, look at the story that Elijah and Elisha raised the widow's son and begin to put these symbols together and maybe figure out what this represents when Jesus raised the widow's son of Nain. But we're going to show you today what it does mean. It's very clear once you really start looking and praying while you seek and asking the Lord for help to understand these things, because Jesus said he'll send his Holy Spirit, which will teach us all things we need to know. We don't need a teacher or rabbi or some church or anybody, because in the latter days it will be revealed to the babes. But the great pious ones who declare themselves to be so great and wonderful don't know a thing. They've lost the truth. They become blind. They're the blind leading the blind right into the pit, Jesus said. But the main body of the population of that town had moved to a city called Nain. So it was really the same people, the same city. They just rebuilt the city a few miles away. About 1,000 years had gone by. A few miles from the International Coastal Highway. It's very likely that even 800 years later, people living just a few miles away from Shunem would remember the story as part of their folklore. If a great biblical miracle occurred a few miles from your house, wouldn't you be proud of that? Yes. When Jesus approached the city of Nain, he discovered a great crowd coming towards him. But the crowd wasn't coming to see him. It was a funeral procession making its way to the burial ground outside the city. And as was with Elisha earlier, the boy who had died was the only son of his mother. Luke records that Jesus had compassion on the mother. And a few short minutes later, the boy is raised and returned to his mother. Given that there were only 3 raisings from the dead in the whole of the Hebrew Bible, it can hardly be a coincidence that this miracle of Jesus happened just a few miles from Elisha's similar miracle. A clear example of biblical parallel, perhaps. Great contrasts. Except there are more contrasts than parallels. Whereas the Shunammite woman reacted to bring back a seemingly reluctant Elisha, Jesus himself approaches the widow from Nain. Now, what's the difference there? Well, in the Old Testament, it was very difficult because Elijah didn't know. It was a great mystery. He did not understand, but the Lord, and he was guided by the Holy Spirit to do this. He himself did not understand what he was doing. It was Jesus, though, that went to the woman of Nain. She didn't come to him. He went to her because he knew, because he was the Lord, the Christ, and it was the appointed time. So where Elisha stands aloof from the woman until the boy is healed, he speaks only to Gehazi. Jesus has compassion on the woman and speaks gently to her. Do not weep, Jesus says. Where Elisha looks initially to the power of his staff in Gehazi's hands to raise the boy, perhaps to avoid either of them becoming defiled by the corpse. Jesus starts by touching the coffin, where Elisha vividly acts the miracle by lying on the boy and then arising. Jesus simply says, young man, I say to you, rise. And perhaps the most important of all, where Elisha's miracle is dependent on prayer, Jesus' miracle is dependent only on his own power. So whereas the reaction to Elisha's miracle is strangely muted, the reaction to Jesus' miracle is marked by a great crowd glorifying the divine Father in heaven. Well, this is telling, we got the same story here, but the reaction that Elisha got was that no one really knew much about it. Even Elijah didn't know what was really going on, because this was prophetic. When Jesus came, he did it with full knowledge, and the world witnessed it and glorified the divine being. Well, look at this. Elijah in the Quran. Elijah in the Quran, who is known as Elias in Arabic, is one of the prophets of the Divine One, who was sent to the group of idolaters in the land of Canaan. His name has been mentioned twice in the Quran. Elijah was one of the prophets of the children of Israel who lived in the city of Baalbek. Isn't that interesting? Where is Baalbek? Isn't it a little bit odd that in our world today we know about the Temple of Jerusalem or the Temple of Solomon? We can't find it. It's not there. We found it in Luxor, Egypt, exactly as it's described. But we can't find the Temple of Solomon. We talk about the wonders of the world. We talk about the Great Pyramid. We talk about all these places. Machu Picchu, the Temple of Artemis. We talk about the Temple of Lucis. But the temple at Baalbek hardly gets a mention. Do you know that that was one of the 7 wonders of the world, the largest temple ever built? The stones are so large that it's inconceivable. It would be impossible to move and position those stones into place by any machine known to man today. It would be completely, absolutely, there's not one crane or truck or engine or power or anything that human beings have in the world today that could move those stones. And I'll show you a picture of those stones. And if you haven't seen it, Baalbek was a veritable wonder. And so why is it that the devil's always building these huge temples, but the Lord doesn't do nothing but, drag a little rock out in the desert, this little rock that Jacob laid his head on and he blessed it, right? What kind of a rock monument did Jacob leave in Abraham? Well, it wasn't what we're told. It was the Great Pyramid. And, this guy was the greatest prophet, Elijah, right? Up there with Moses, Elijah, and Jesus. Well, Elijah goes from Bethel, and he goes up to Mount Carmel and raises the widow's son of Zarephath. Zarephath is a place in Syria. Baalbek is in Syria. Let me show you a picture where they're claiming Mount Carmel is and these places that we talk about. They're claiming they're farther south, even further south than Sidon or Tyre. But in reality, where Elijah went was Baalbek. Well, I could not find. I spent about an hour trying to find a map. I had earlier seen a map where everything that I needed to show you was on there. But I've lost that map and I can't find it. It's like they just don't want to produce any maps anymore. But this will probably suffice. If you look at this map, you see Galilee. That's supposedly a place where Jesus was. Well, that's not what it was, because Galilee means the circuit. And if you look at the New Testament, you'll see he went on his circuit and he kept coming to these towns. But in this area that they claim that Galilee was, by the Sea of Galilee, and they've got their Nazareth, right there in the middle, supposedly where Jesus was. But of course, they've admitted now that there is no town of Nazareth. They just made it up. Actually, it was a community of Nazarenes. It was a group of Essenes or priests. And so there is no town of Nazareth. A lot of these towns they kind of make up because they read the story in the Bible and they've just sort of pretended they can figure out where they were. So they've got Cana up there, and look at below Nazareth is Nain. Now that's where Jesus went to the widow at Nain and raised up her son. Well, where is that compared to Mount Carmel? Supposedly, they say Mount Carmel is to the, I guess, west of there. You see there Mount Carmel in the middle of the screen. So, supposedly, the Sea of Galilee and Mount Carmel and Nain, that's where Elijah and Elisha went and raised up the widow's son. This is Zarephath. No, Zarephath is in Syria, further north. What's up in Syria? Well, Damascus. And just a little bitty ways from Damascus, and you can't see it here, but it would be right about there where there is nothing marked. That is where Baalbek was. Now, just a little north of Sidon. And, well, there is Zarephath right there by Sidon. So the widow of Zarephath was up here by Sidon. Well, again, they probably don't know for sure where any of these cities are. Well, let me show you another map here for a second. I don't know if this one will work because it's difficult, but remember now we were looking at where Sidon was, right? Okay, just a little bit north of that and to the right is Baalbek, which is very close to where Damascus is. And remember, Paul was going on the road to Damascus to be initiated into the mysteries. So the Quran says that Elijah went to Baalbek. You would have to go, it'd probably take several hours to prove that they don't know where any of these places are. They're making it up. They're reading a story and they're trying to figure out the locations of these places, and then they put these place names in this little land they call Palestine or Israel today, but we have no idea where any of these places were, where Abraham was. They really have lost all credibility in telling us any of this history. But I will tell you that Baalbek is in Syria, not far from Damascus, where the mysteries were, where the Essenes were, where they wrote a book called the Damascus Document, the Damascus Scroll. It's in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And that is where Elijah went, according to the Quran. So, now, we know that it was not originally called Baalbek, but the temple of Bacchus, where they turned the water into wine, sometimes called Dionysus. These mysteries ended up in Italy, in the area around Rome. There's a temple of Dionysus. So these temples that were originally placed there by Elisha and Elijah were rebuilt other places. They had other temples further north, up into Rome, up into Greece. But this was the first, the great, one of the seven wonders of the world, that all of a sudden, for some strange, crazy reason, we know that there was the temple of Bacchus there, the original temple of Dionysus, the original temple of Elias, according to the Quran. We know that that's true, but we've seemed to have forgotten all about this. But why would this temple that was either made by Elijah or condoned by Elijah, why would it be called Baalbek? What does it have to do with Baal? So it says that, indeed, Elias was one of the prophets. After the capture of Jerusalem, a tribe from the Israelites settled north in Baalbek. They were ruled by a tyrant king. It is reported that the city was originally called Bek, but the king had an idol made by the name of Baal and forced people to worship it. Later, the names Baal and Bek were combined, and the city was henceforth called Baal-Bek. It was there that Elias was sent as a prophet to invite its people back to the truth. So, it wasn't really originally called Baal-Bek, but it was a very large and amazing temple, one of the 7 wonders of the world. What was it actually called originally? Let me show you. So, it's hard to read this, but because they've got this picture, and so the words are on the left side. But it says, the temple of Bachus has stood in the city of Baalbek, Lebanon, for nearly 2,000 years. That goes back to the days of Jesus, okay? It was the temple of Bacchus. Some of you probably already know before we read this, that Bacchus was the god that changed the water into wine. Sometimes they call him Dionysus. We've talked about how Jesus, his first miracle was to turn the water into wine, declaring himself to be the one who is bringing these mysteries of Bacchus into fruition. He's the one that began these mysteries. So in the world, they use other words. Well, this place of Bacchus or Dionysus was at Baalbek, Lebanon, for nearly 2,000 years. And it says, the temple is filled with carvings and statues of Bacchus. Historians are not entirely sure whether the temple was dedicated to the Roman deity of wine, or if it served in... They don't even know what they're talking... They talk like it's all pagan. They worshipped wine. No, they didn't. Did Jesus worship wine? Did they worship wine, the Christians, because they drank the wine? I mean, this is ridiculous. It was a holy sacrament. The temple was dedicated to the Roman god of wine, or if it served another purpose, it is apparent that the temple was built to inspire awe in the people of ancient Lebanon and to make them worship Roman deities. Oh yeah, it was all pagan. Never mind that Elijah is the one that began this particular mystery school. The school of the prophets. They moved from Bethel to Baalbek, which was originally a great temple, an Elysian temple, or Elisha's temple. From 1898 to 1903, a German expedition conducted excavations in the site and discovered that the temple. And then in 1920, the Lebanese government started to repair and reconstruct the remains and They don't even hardly know what this thing is. Well, I'll show you some pictures of this thing here. Take a look at this. This is the stones that they used to build this temple. It's not standing today, of course. It's been a couple thousand years. Now imagine, we talk about the Great Pyramid, it might have been 10,000 years old or more. And the stones are very massive, and we talk about this, how it would be impossible for humans to do this. Well, take a look at this one, where Elijah went. Look at the stone there. At the Baalbek stones are 6 massive Roman worked stone blocks in Baalbek. Ancient Heliopolis, Lebanon, characterized by a megalithic gigantism unparalleled in antiquity. Unparalleled. Look at that stone. Do you think there's a crane or any kind of machine that could literally lift that stone at all? The smallest 3 are part of the podium wall in the Roman complex of the temple of Jupiter, Baal. See, they've renamed these temples many times, but Jupiter's also Zeus, which in Greek mythology would be Deus or Theos in the Greek New Testament. That's the divine being. On Tel Baalbek, and are known as the Trilithion. Each of these is estimated at about 750 to 800 tons. Can you imagine a stone being 700 to 800 tons? The remaining 3 are Roman monoliths, not part of a larger structure, conventionally known as the Stone of the Pregnant Woman. Oh, there's another woman, and she's going to have a child, right? Like Elisha did, remember? Caused this infertile, barren woman to have a baby. The Stone of the South and the Forgotten Stone. These are in reverse order. The first, third, and the and tied fist, largest known stones ever quarried in the human history. So they're the largest stones ever made. Now, we don't know what the temple looked like because it's all fallen over. It's not there. It's in ruins. But we can imagine if they had stones like that, it must have been one heck of a temple. They believed to have been intended for the nearby Jupiter-Baal complex. See, I don't even believe that many of those original pillars and stuff like we see there, the Temple of Baal, a lot of that was built at later times. But anyway, guys, we're going to have to stop here because we're over an hour, but got so much more to tell you guys. There's going to be another video, maybe another video or two, because I want to thoroughly give you all the information about where these mysteries actually began. When they came up through the line of Zerah to Zarephath in Syria, and went from there to Troy, and as we've said, on to Rome. And so that is why there is a temple of Dionysus in Rome that is the exact same kind of temple or type of mystery religion that we have there at Bachus, because it was originally given to the world by the great prophet Elijah. So we'll stop there, but tomorrow we're going to try to explain and cover all the history through Rome and how it's come down to us. There's the whole Pontifex Maximus thing. The Pope thinks he's got that position now, which is crazy, but the whole point of the Pontifex Maximus was to keep the fires burning that they put out in 394, long before the Pope ever came along. He retained those titles, but that entire, the mysteries, they forbade and they apostatized and destroyed it. And to this day, it is completely gone from the psyche of human beings. We've lost all this knowledge. So we'll talk about the Vestal Virgins and the whole administration of the kingdom of the Lord in tomorrow's video. I hope you guys have a really great day. We'll see you tomorrow. Have a good one.